Good evening. It's January 31st, 2014. My name is Matthew Ogden, and I'm very happy to be hosting tonight's webcast. We're featuring Mr. LaRouche, as we do every Friday night. This is our regular webcast on LaRouchepack.com, although I will say now that we will be having a special webcast tomorrow afternoon also, which will be featuring members of the LaRouche Pack basement team. This is called The Continuing Gifts of Prometheus, so you can be sure to tune in at 3 o'clock Eastern Time tomorrow as well. I'm joined in the studio today by Dennis Mason and Dennis Small, who will be asking a series of questions along with myself for Mr. LaRouche to respond to. And we will begin with our first question, which has come in from a Washington-based institutional contact who asks simply, Mr. LaRouche, President Obama, in his State of the Union address, did not reveal any significant new economic initiatives, leading to a general conclusion that the United States is heading in the right direction. How do you see the state of the United States and global economies in 2014 and beyond?
Well, first of all, the State of the Union address was mostly a bunch of garbage or outright lies. And with that, you can dispense with the president as such. And the question what he might do is possible to be considered. What he said what he's doing in the speech was mostly lies or stupid, silly diversions, which had no correspondence to any reality at all, except one lamed victim of military service was put on display in a very untasteful manner. And he shouldn't, I suppose it may have done him some good psychologically because he's been cranked up to that. But I was disgusted by it because he was being exploited. And it was just a distraction used by the president to just somehow take the bad taste off everything else he had said. And that was bad taste too. You have to have a respect for people. You don't pity people because they're crippled. You show respect for them not by fantasies, but show respect for them by thinking about what they need. Well, let's get back to the reality then. All right. The president's speech, if it had any content at all, was a damn lie. There was nothing he said that was true, a bunch of fantasies which had no reality to anything. And I fear that if this president, current president, were to retain office, I fear that as long as he remains office, because I know what he is, I know what he isn't. What he's good at is playing basketball between the one side of the White House, which is the family side, and running around in his jockstrap or the similar with the basketball bouncing, going to another room to the official side of the White House. There's not much substance to this creature. But first of all, he's a liar. The United States has been, since actually the assassination of John F. Kennedy and the inauguration of the Indochina War by the United States, we had no reason to get into it. Douglas MacArthur at the time said there's no reason to get into it. He said don't do it. Kennedy was not going to allow it to happen, so they wanted a war, so they shot Kennedy. That's simple. And if you look through the record, that's not the first time a president of the United States was assassinated. And these assassinations were never random people. They may have a kook story about some kook ran loose and killed a president. These were never kook stories. In every case I know of, the evidence was this was a planned assassination directed from the British monarchy. Every one of these assassinations. And there's the proof of the matter. Every case. The most notable one, for example, was actually Abraham Lincoln. But we also had others. John F. Kennedy was that. His brother, who was just about to be designated as a Democratic candidate for president, was assassinated too. And one of the greatest presidents, at the close of the 19th century, was then assassinated to bring in a guy who was actually a stooge for he was the nephew of the guy who organized the wave of assassinations from Britain in the name of the Confederacy. So that's the history. If you want to find out why we get bad presidents, I'm familiar with the record of every bad president. As a matter of fact, I have been familiar with every president. Not necessarily personally, but I've observed them in detail and studied them. I know their history. That's one of my specialties. And if you take a list, as I've just written a report, which will be published later this week or next week, and in this report I lay this out. Do you realize how few of the presidents of the United States were not traitors to the United States? How few? You go through the list, any one of you goes through the list of presidents, and you will find that, Jackson, and you go the whole list. Jefferson was a bum. He ruined the United States. He connived with a British agent who was an assassin, who assassinated Hamilton, and so forth and so on. So the problem is, the United States has always been cursed by the fact, since that time, since the Washington administration, since that moment, there have been British-directed assassinations or otherwise. As a matter of fact, the center of that was always the British monarchy. And most of the dirty work was done initially around New York City. You take the case of Hamilton. Where was the assassination of Hamilton done? In the New York City area. Hamilton had a lot of problem with New York City. Why? Because the problem we had in that period is that around the New York area, there was a concentration of British banks of the British Empire. And they had branches there. You had key figures, the financial interests of Europe, but especially the British Empire interests, controlled the New York banking system then and still today. This is Wall Street. Wall Street is the enemy of the United States. And Wall Street is good for only one thing: stealing and killing. So a problem is that since recently, we've had the majority of presidents of the United States were worse than bums in terms of their lack of patriotism and the actions they took in support of the interests of the British Empire against the United States itself. Now, most people will have all these explanations. Well, this event happened here, that's a story. That event happened over there, that's a story. There are no separate stories. There's a war conducted largely against the American people and conducted inside the United States, from outside, or from the British system, largely through the British influence, a powerful influence over the U.S. banking system. And Wall Street has been traditionally the enemy of the United States. You want to save this nation from war, from treason, from suffering, from mass murder, kick Wall Street out of the United States. And it'll work. So we've got, the problem is the questions on this, from popular standpoint. People don't like to think about this. And that's why people don't know how to vote right most of the time. Because they're not willing to face the truth about the situation which our nation faces, and especially as it centers around the fate of the presidency. A majority of our presidents in the United States up to this date have been worse than bums. They have been all either corrupted by foreign interests or they are representatives of foreign interests. Jackson, for example. Jackson had always been an evil fellow, as long as he lived. He was not a very intelligent person. Stupid people praised him, but they only did that because they were stupid. Anybody who knew Jackson, what he did with the Indians and so forth, the kind of mass murder he perpetrated, the kind of swindles he pulled off, the fact that he was a sub-agent of the British Empire, of Aaron Burr. He was a sub-agent of the British agent and killer Aaron Burr. That's how he got his career. Then you had his co-president, his vice president and co-president was actually his controller. And he represented the New York banking institution, Van Buren. What do you think of that? Van Buren then, when he himself in turn, he sank the whole U.S. economy with a great swindle he pulled off. He bankrupted the United States. Aaron Burr organized that presidency. And he stayed with that function until he himself had died. Died of probably natural causes, or we call his continued life unnatural. And we had the same thing. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was trained by the leader of the Confederacy killer force, agents. He trained him. Theodore Roosevelt was trained by the guy who did the mass killing of Americans under British direction. And he had 2 terms in office. How did he get them? The assassination of the legitimate president, which began, we had nothing good to speak of between the assassination of that president and the time that Franklin Roosevelt finally got into office. What you take since? Kennedy was assassinated. What kind of presidents did we have after that? We had some presidents who were not bad. A few. Bill Clinton was one of them. Bill Clinton actually had capabilities. His vice president was a real louse, crawling all over himself. But Bill was not too bad. They ruined him. But they set up an operation which was set up and directed by the British Army, British Empire. So now you look, we had a president who was not bad. Then what we get? We got Bushes. Now what are the Bush family? Well, Prescott Bush was the guy who put Hitler into power. He did it for the same thing the Wall Street crowd in the United States, which was Wall Street, British, both sides. Then what did we get later? We got a President Clinton. Because Bush was so bad, the people began vomiting, and so they had to get he couldn't stand, H.W. couldn't make it. People just kept vomiting politically. They didn't want him around anymore. And now last time I saw, he was running around in a kiddie car and wearing strange socks. I don't think he's got all his marbles together anymore. But his son was really a dope addict who was not really president. He was controlled by a bunch of these clowns, which were also responsive to the British monarchy. And then you got the worst president we ever had, one you have now. That's why, if the American people have been conditioned to accept these kinds of presidents so often, that we don't have a presidency and haven't had recently a presidency which is actually responsive to the U.S. federal Constitution. So what we've come to with the assassination of Jack Kennedy, what we've come to is a point since that time, his assassination and the prompt, and he was the one who opposed with Douglas MacArthur, opposed any intervention of the United States into a war in Indochina. The immediate reason for the assassination of Kennedy by people including the FBI was done to allow the United States to have a war, to be sunk in a war in Indochina. All right, that's part of it. That gives you the picture when you're talking about this question. All right, the problem is you have an American citizenry and institutions. You had preferences for election to Congress. And most of the people who were elected to Congress were selected with some kind of direct or indirect influence over them by Wall Street, mostly Wall Street, but Wall Street as a channel for obedience of the Americans to the British Empire. So therefore, we've spent most of our life with that in this nation, under those conditions. We won our freedom. But the British Empire began to learn how to take us out. And assassinations of presidents and similar kinds of people, of ranks of patriots, are the means by which our government has been controlled. Lincoln, for example. Who killed Lincoln? No mystery. The British Empire. Who? Well, this was organized through the same guy who trained a certain Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt. And this guy was put into power, how? By the assassination of one of the best presidents we ever had, McKinley. And Theodore Roosevelt was implicitly involved in setting up the assassination. And this is what we have. This is what Bush represents. He's not the president. He's nominally the president. He's a clown. He came into a position, he had no political perspective whatsoever. But there was a certain woman, well known to every American who's well informed, who had been an American living in and cultivated in the United Kingdom. She's a British agent, in fact. She returned her attentions to the United States, concentrating on the Chicago area. And she was part of the team which took this no-good, useless, foolish creature, Obama, and they ran a swindle with the help of the drug-pushing agencies of the British monarchy and bringing this clown Obama into the presidency. What was his function? It was a function to give us no president. He's a no president, but he occupies the power. He operates under direction from London. He's not a patriot of the United States. I don't think if he knows he's capable of whether he is a president or not. But he's just a nasty personality and kept that way. And he has no brains, and you saw in his address just this week, you saw an address which is the worst piece of incompetent crap ever presented by anyone, that's maybe Andrew Jackson, but anyone, of all presidents whose presidential addresses, his was the most disgusting of them all. And everything about he did was a complete lie. And there was no substantive content in it, and that was the only redeeming quality of it. It had no substance whatsoever. But it was absolute trash rather than having substance. So when you're talking about this kind of business, you've got to get down, especially now, when we're at a point where the whole United States is at jeopardy. We're at a point where we're on the verge, within a period, which I can fairly estimate, between now and sometime in March. We are on a world scale now preparing for a global thermonuclear war. The war is to be fought and is set up to be fought as a thermonuclear war. And the thermonuclear war is intended to be, and being prepared to be, a thermonuclear war between, on the one side, the transatlantic region and the Eurasian region. And what you're seeing right there on the edge of Russia, you're seeing conflict. The conflict is actually a prelude to an intended early thermonuclear war. A thermonuclear war intended to be fought by, on one side, with the help of all the Saudis and so forth, a war being fought as a thermonuclear war from the start between the transatlantic region, the power of the transatlantic region, which is actually an imperial British power, essentially. And on the other side, Eurasia. Not just Russia, not just China, India, and so forth. And in the midst of these, you have a squabble, the terrorist buildup, which has built up actually since the initial Chechen wars in the North Caucasus. And the North Caucasus area is still the center. And the war there is being fought by what? By Nazis. Because the Nazi regime, with British consent, took the SS and related forces recruited from that area and made them permanent Nazis. The protest groups inside there, not today, that protest group is actually a Nazi organization. It still has insignia based on the time that the parents of these families were all Nazis. So therefore you have the British Empire, again, using Nazis against Russia. And the United States, under this presidency, is complicit in the whole dirty business. Now, so therefore, the question is, we're now looking at a global thermonuclear war. The parties are, on the one side, the transatlantic region, the United States and so forth, and Western Europe, on the one side. On the other side, the Slavic area, Russia in particular, Ukraine actually involved in this, China a major power, India a major power. And therefore you have these two regions of the planet who are now armed and mobilizing and playing the preliminary games of pre-warfare, who are aiming. We are now at the point that the real war has begun. The real thermonuclear war has begun by various actions to prepare for that war. We are in a short time countdown between now and probably sometime in early March, by which time a thermonuclear war under present conditions will happen. Now the question is, how do we stop it from happening? Well, the two things I have to say at that point. First is, remove Obama from the presidency. He's a liar, he's no good, he's really an enemy agent. In whatever guise, he may be just a bomb, but we know what he is, he's useless. Pulling Obama out of the presidency by impeachment, and all the preconditions for impeachment, summary impeachment, exist. If he were removed, my guess is that by releasing the British control, represented by Obama, from the United States government, you would actually create a situation in which other reactions would occur, and the United States would refuse to go into a thermonuclear war. As long as Obama is able to continue his role as leadership in the United States, we are headed for a thermonuclear war of mutual destruction. So therefore, anyone who's trying to keep Obama in trade in the presidency, he's not really the controller, but the British Empire is. But in order to tame the American people into a state of stupidity, they have to believe that this monkey, and he is a monkey essentially as far as politics are concerned, as long as they believe that he is the president and that he can give the authorities of the president You're in danger of an actual thermonuclear war. If he is impeached, as he should be, as a matter of fact, this speech we just heard this week would be an excellent reason for impeaching him. One of the best, right? He nakedly has shown himself how worthless he is in office. Throw him out of office. Impeach the guy. He's an animal, not a human being. But now let's look at what the other problem is, the other side of this. Most people, citizens in the United States, and in general in Europe too, with some exceptions here and there, have no understanding of the principle of warfare. What do you get? They say, so-and-so is going to fight so-and-so. You mean a boxing match? A wrestling match? Huh? Is that what you're talking about? Maybe with knives involved? Maybe with bullets involved? Maybe with a hand grenades too? But that's not strategy. That's insanity. So therefore, as long as people think that warfare and going to war against an adversary is playing those kinds of tactical games, like street war, on this extended basis, they have no comprehension whatsoever of what strategy is. And most people, except top military and a few other people in the world, have a very almost incompetent. They're not MacArthur's. Douglas MacArthur was a real thinker, and we had other people who were real officers, real commanders. And they understood strategy. But strategy is not necessarily warfare. Warfare will break out to become strategy, to become a subject of strategy. But strategy is the way we organize the human species on the planet as a whole. Or it used to be, there are certain parts of the planet which were relatively isolated regions, transportation and other things of that sort. You would have the most serious war were large migrations of mounted horsemen. And that way you could extend the area which would become actually a strategic area. But in a larger part, the communication systems were such, you had very poor strategic relations with different territories on the planet. For example, take the case of Europe and Asia, Eurasia as such, and compare that to what became the Americas. There was almost no strategic significant relationship across the Atlantic Ocean. And certain parts of the Pacific Ocean the same. What happened with modern society and mobility of populations, now the whole world as a whole becomes a cockpit of potential warfare. Under these circumstances, the question of strategy becomes a military strategy. At the same time, strategy becomes an economic strategy, not just a military one. It becomes an economic strategy and a cultural one. How nations trade, how they agree, how they communicate, how their economies are connected, how they reverberate in connections from one to the other. Any territory on the surface of the planet Earth which has that kind of integrity is global. It's strategic. If you had an area of the world which does not have connections outside that limited area, that's also strategy. But it's not global strategy. It's strategy still. And strategy is not intended for warfare. Strategy may lead to warfare within the context of warfare. But therefore, we have to look at the process as a strategic question. The point is, if the President of the United States were to be removed from office now, it would be the probable case, that by removing this fellow to being an instrument of the powers of a president, you would suddenly get an uncorking of the threat of thermonuclear war. Because people in general do not want to be assassinated in a frying expedition, a global frying expedition of thermonuclear warfare. And the fact is that the people out there, our people, do not understand this. Therefore, they are stupid enough or stupefied enough that as long as they believe they have to learn to work with our president, we are headed for thermonuclear war. So if someone says, strategy is how we're going to win the war. Strategy, if you understand it and have any brains at all, strategy is to not have the war. Strategy is to change the relations among nations throughout the planet and throughout regions of the planet in such a way that you have an economic policy rather than a genocide policy. And the point is, when you confront people, if you confront them with the reality of what strategy really means, which the four fellows never did understand, but once they get the idea of what strategy really is, they will not allow war to occur. Only Nazis, like the Nazis functioning in Ukraine. They are Nazis. And the United States government and the British are backing Nazis against Russia. And that's the way to look at this thing.
Well, let me fill in a little bit on what you just stated on the subject of Ukraine. As you just said, and also as you emphasized during a discussion that we had on Monday with the LaRouche Policy Committee, you stressed on Monday that the threat in Ukraine is not one of a civil war, something that's merely limited to the geographic location of Ukraine, but that this is the threat of a world war, that this would become the flashpoint for a thermonuclear World War III. What you said is, this is not a civil war. It's the advanced stage of a general thermonuclear warfare between two blocks on the planet. That's what we're facing. Now, since then, since Monday, more people have begun to acknowledge exactly what you said, that the implication of the chaos in the streets of Kiev is this danger of world war. In an article published on Wednesday in The Guardian, titled, "In Ukraine, Fascists, Oligarchs, and Western Expansion at the Heart of the Crisis," the story we're being told about the protests gripping Kiev bears only the sketchiest relationship with reality. The author, named Seamus Milne, warns, quote, "The Ukrainian fault line has the potential to draw in outside powers and lead to a strategic clash. Continuing outside interference is both provocative and dangerous." In an article also published this week in the German magazine Cicero, a fellow Alexander Rahr, who's a Russia expert, points to the danger of splitting up Ukraine into two halves, which is now being actively discussed. Ukraine being the second largest nation in Europe, into a so-called pro-EU western part, and then a pro-Russian eastern part. And he compared this to Yugoslavia in the 1990s. But, he said, unlike the Yugoslav Civil War, the intervention of a NATO peacekeeping force in Ukraine is to be ruled out, because the risk of a military confrontation with the nuclear power Russia is too big. And then Stephen Cohen, who's a professor of Russian studies at NYU, said in an interview that he delivered yesterday with Amy Goodwin that what's happening in the streets of Ukraine is, as he called it, a coup d'etat being run by right-wing Nazi extremists against a democratically elected government. He said, "Who precipitated this crisis? It was the European Union. Essentially, Ukraine was given an ultimatum. Sign the EU economic agreement or else." Now, what was that agreement? He said. It would have been an economic catastrophe for Ukraine. What did the EU offer? The same austerity policies that are ravaging Europe. nothing more. What's more, if you read the protocols of the European offer to Ukraine, there is a big clause on military cooperation in there. In effect, Stephen Cohen said, by signing this, Ukraine would have had to abide by NATO's military policies. What would that mean? That would mean drawing a new Cold War line, which used to be in Berlin, right down the heart of Slavic civilization, right on Russia's borders. Now, finally, today, Sergei Glaziev, who's well known to you and is a close advisor of Vladimir Putin, delivered an interview where he cited the fact that over the past 20 years, billions of dollars have been pumped into Ukraine by the United States and by NATO to shape what he called Russophobic attitudes in Ukrainian society. Glaziev said, quote, "Thus, the factor of outside interference today is factor number one that needs to be taken into account. We are not dealing with Bonderists or neo-Nazis who have suddenly crawled out of the forest, but rather with the deliberate, systematic operations of a propaganda machine that has already crushed more than one government in the world, and which today has created the explosive situation in Ukraine." Now, before I ask you to comment, Lynn, since you've emphasized that the key is to continue to highlight this fascist nature of the street protesters in Ukraine, I think it's worthwhile to draw attention to a statement that Natalia Vitrenko, who is chairwoman of the Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, issued this week along with 28 other organizations in Ukraine. This was addressed to the leaders of Europe and to the United States. What they say is the following, quote, "The political crisis in Ukraine is worsening by the day. This is a foreign project to seize Ukraine. It is being implemented against the interests and the demands of our people. It is being carried out unconstitutionally and in violation of international norms and principles. We deem it necessary to draw your close attention to the nature of the political forces that have organized the Euromaidan. These terrorists have not only launched bloodletting with law enforcement agencies, but are seizing government buildings, smashing and burning the party offices of their political opponents, and applying mob law against the citizens of Ukraine. You should understand that in supporting the actions of the guerrillas in Ukraine, you yourselves are directly protecting, inciting, and egging on Ukrainian neo-Nazis and neo-fascists. None of these oppositionists, Yatsenyuk, Klitschko, Tyanibuk, none of them hide that they are continuing the ideology and practices of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and its military wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, led by Stepan Bandera, who was the leading Nazi collaborator during World War II in Ukraine, who organized the underground support for Nazi operations and the Nazi invasion, and participated directly in the ethnic cleansing of foreigners in 1943, during which 100,000 Poles were massacred. Vitrenko says they punctuate all of their speeches at the Maidan with cries of "Glory to Ukraine, to the hero's glory." This Nazi greeting was adopted by the Ukrainian nationalists in April of 1941 and was copied from the analogous slogans of Hitler's Nazi Party. Other regular slogans of the Maidan are "Glory to Ukraine, death to the enemies," "Ukraine above all," which echoes Deutschland über alles, "Ukraine for Ukrainians," and "Stab the Muscovites and hang the commies." So after citing numerous other explicitly pro-Nazi symbols and slogans that are being used by the leaders of the protest, Vitrenko states, Washington and Brussels are either following the risky course of ignoring the Nazi nature of the Euromaidan, or they are consciously closing their eyes and covering up the fascist ideology of the parliamentary opposition and the Euromaidan in Ukraine. It is appropriate to ask, have the UN, the EU, and the USA ceased to recognize the charter and verdict of the International War Crimes Tribunal at Nuremberg? Have human rights ceased to be of value for the countries of the EU and the world community? Is the Ukrainian nationalist devotion to Hitler and his mass murders of civilians now considered democracy? We, as leaders of Ukrainian political parties and public organizations, express our concern that politicians and officials from the UN, the EU, and the USA, and the international community have a distorted perception of the events being organized to bring about a coup d'etat in Ukraine and are not taking effective measures to stop this fascist coup.
Well, safely reach your destination. Okay. That's all true. I think you've covered the documentation, which I already have, in large degree. But this still misses the point. And now we've said that, now you posed a question. Why would, since this would lead to a thermonuclear war between the region of the transatlantic region and the Eurasian region as a whole, because they will not, because as Putin had said on one remark, as long as we are able to use the present kind of government. What does he mean? He means that they're ready to go to thermonuclear war. Why? Are they crazy? No. Because the British and the present government of the United States are committed to a thermonuclear war against Eurasia. Now, not down the line. Now, this is what's happening right now. If you look at the history of general warfare, since the process of the ouster of Bismarck, because Bismarck's ouster from a position as a Chancellor of Germany opened up the gates because he kept the whole thing together. And the British influence on the German organization, the German Kaiser, what this did, they got into quarrels between Germany and Russia and so forth in Central Europe. These quarrels in Central Europe became the basis for launching World War I and World War II. Both of these were organized by the British Empire. There is no such thing as a British kingdom. It doesn't exist. It's a fraud. It really isn't really British. The British Empire was Dutch. Remember your history? How did the British Empire come into being? First, there was the 17th century. The entirety of the 17th century in Europe. That's how the British Empire was created. Then, having done a job on the inhabitants of the 17th century, the Dutch influence invaded, crossed the British Channel, the English Channel, and took over England and began to butcher the Irish. So what happened is the Dutch, who controlled the whole business, created from the inside a puppet called the British Empire. So now, what's going on now? Then the British Empire actually dominates the world. The United States is crippled because our presidents are British agents, or damn fools who don't know what an agent is. The President of the United States is a British agent, part of an imperial system. So what's this war all about? What are the conditions of warfare? Let's be strategic, not gossips. The conditions are you have two powers on this planet. Each of them is thermonuclear in capability and prepared for a first start thermonuclear launch, a massive one, on both sides. Both sides are prepared that they shall not wait for the other side to attack. They are going to attack, in effect, simultaneously. And what purpose will that meet? Well, let's look at the British monarchy. Look at the Empress, the third, or the second, or whatever it is, Elizabeth II. I think the third is coming. What's this all about? Well, the Queen has made it very clear since her little dirty expedition into Copenhagen. It main was to reduce the population of the planet from 7 billion persons to about less than 1. That's what the war is about. This is the policy of Zeus. If you don't know your history, and you don't know what Zeus means, and what the policies as Aeschylus lays them out, this is what it's all about. The British Empire says we have too many people on this planet, which is what Zeus said. Zeus even proposed to exterminate people. All the poor people would be exterminated. Well, that's what the Queen intends. That's not just the Queen's idea. It's not that she's some mad person. She's probably crazy. But it's not that kind of madness we're talking about. It's the madness of an oligarchy. It's the madness we see in Wall Street, which is an echo of this obscenity. Who demanded the depopulation of the United States now? Who insisted on cutting people off all kinds of financial support? Who insisted on cutting health care? Who insisted on this stuff? The British monarchy. What's the green policy? It's that policy. The green policy is a mass murderers problem. And a lot of dumb jerks in the United States have swallowed the greenie policy. And the dumb jerks in Europe have swallowed the greenie policy. But that one thing is left. Thermonuclear power. Do you think that either the Eurasian side or the transatlantic side is prepared to go to a war which only gradually will come to a general thermonuclear war? No. It's been clear you have to study all the writings of all the governments on this question. Policy is you don't go step by step up to thermonuclear war, which was the myth that was spread before. Where was this policy started? It was started by Winston Churchill and by the bastard who controlled him. And that was a policy imposed upon the Truman administration at the end of the war, after Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was dead. And Truman was nothing but a stooge for the British. He was never anything different. Particularly his recruitment was Wall Street. What's the danger to you in the United States? Wall Street. You want peace? Eliminate Wall Street. Because you eliminate Wall Street, then Obama can be easily thrown out of office. And there will be no dirty president as a stooge to organize war. Because the people of the United States, probably 80%, at least 60%, probably 80% of the people of the United States do not want war, and they will actually try to prevent it. Remove Obama. Remove Obama, then remove Wall Street as a power. And you'll get your country back. And Russia and China have no interest because they're growing powers, they're economic growing. Whereas contrary to that lying bastard, so-called president, who said the economy is better than ever, he's the worst liar on the planet, or the most consummate liar on the planet. Because the United States presently is at the lowest point of what it has been since Kennedy was assassinated. ever since John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and once the minute that war in Indochina started with American participation, the United States economy has, in fact, despite that lying fool idiot called a president, the United States has actually, in terms of actual physical standards, per capita standards, the United States economy has been in a process of decline every day since the initial period of the war in Indochina. The United States economy has been going down, 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 down. And the green policy has been the policy which has catalyzed the destruction of the mines as well as the incomes of the American population. If you remove this factor, then we could have our nation back. And that does not mean we're threatened by Russia or China. That means that the world at large does not want war. They do not want terror. They want to live. They want to have children. They want to think their lives mean something, that they're living to create a new generation and a generation to come. They're looking for the opportunity to develop things where they can go from decline and decadence and hopelessness into recovery. That's strategy. But the problem is we have too many people who use the word strategy and haven't got the damned slightest understanding of what the word means.
Okay. Well, I have a question, and you addressed some of this during your answer to the institutional question. But I have a question about the institution of the United States presidency. The United States has endured 2 terms of George Bush Jr., and we are enduring a second term of Obama, which threatens our very existence and threatens a war of the type which no one can survive, as you just outlined. Now, neither Bush Jr. nor Barack Obama were the authors of their own policies. They served and serve, Obama serves as a conduit for British imperial policy. Now, we haven't had presidents who have moved to act in the interests of the people here in the United States since the Clinton presidency and since Reagan. Those presidents moved to act independently from the empire, and the counterattacks against them were not only attacks against them as president, but were attacks against the institution of the presidency. Now, in the case of Reagan, there was at least a twofold attack. First, of course, there was the outright assassination attempt. Secondly, there was the unlawful trial and imprisonment of you, Lynn. The attack on you as an independent citizen brought into policy shaping by the President of the United States was an attack on the institution of the presidency, both against any president who would dare to do such a thing and against any private citizen who would dare step to the stage of statecraft in that capacity. Now, President Clinton was the last of the recent presidents who acted independently and in the interests of the people. When he was set up for his scandal, he was making a move toward a new Bretton Woods, a new financial architecture around what you had been organizing around at the time. And he was attacked for that. The attack on President Clinton has had a corollary effect. Again, not merely the attack on the individual president, but on the presidency as an institution, namely impeachment, which is the most effective tool for defending the presidency, has become degraded and belittled. Often now when people think of impeachment, they think of the circus, which was the Clinton trial. Now, over the course of the State of the Union, Mr. Barack Obama belittled the Congress on several occasions. He said prominently several times that he would not be waiting on the United States Congress in order to take action. And we're moving toward the consolidation of an imperial presidency here in the United States, and Barack Obama needs to be impeached. Now, the direct question that I have is, what can we do most efficiently and effectively to reverse the attack and restore the institution of the presidency as such?
You can't do it. That won't work. There's no way that'll work. Not possible. See, the point is, this has been going on all along. If you take the numbers I've indicated earlier tonight, if you take the record of the presidents of the United States and make a list of them, and say what's their characteristic, you say, crap. No? There are very few exceptions. There are exceptions. Good presidents have been exceptions in the history of the U.S. presidency. Most of them were whores of one degree or another, who were controlled from London. Bush is nothing. Young Bush, he doesn't even know where his diapers are. He never did. He's a drug addict. What was young Bush? His father wasn't much of brains. You ought to see him now with that kiddie car he runs around in sometimes. He there's not much going on up there that's of any interest to society. There never was much. He was a faker. He learned to be a pilot in World War II. He went out there with a special kind of aircraft at that time. We carry some people in the back and so forth. It was that kind of situation. He was a pilot. He thought the plane had been hit fatally. He jumped from the parachute and left his other comrades hanging up there without not being the pilot, trying to survive and get out with their own parachutes in time to live. So this clown is not really much. Never was. The problem is his father, Prescott Bush. And if you want to understand the Bush family and the U.S. presidency, you have to understand who Prescott Bush was. Prescott Bush was a part of a British-dominated influence group operating into the United States. The Bush family, Prescott Bush, was the guy who put Adolf Hitler into power in Germany. Because Hitler was about to lose the ability to do something because he was going to go to jail for his debt obligations. Under German law, he would have gone to prison, and that would have been the end of him. Prescott Bush bailed Hitler out personally. But it was done by a group of people who were also what you would call the Wall Street crowd. In other words, a Wall Street unit. The sons, George H.W. Bush, was a fool, as his management with that little thing in a plane over the Pacific would indicate. And he did other things. He was really a goofball. We always knew he was a goofball, but he was a Prescott Bush's boy. And he belonged to the same clan that Prescott Bush belonged to. And Prescott Bush trained him, or had him trained. This whole thing in history is well known. It's on the record to people of my generation. We all knew these facts about this poor clown. Then you had a case later of the younger Bush, George W. Bush Jr. Oh boy, what a prize. World War II came along, and George Bush Jr. came into he was going to be service. They tried to find a place, the Bush family tried to find a place to put this poor idiot, who was already showing signs of so what they did is they stuffed him on the Texas Guard, that is the flight guard, and so the Texas didn't want this clown. They knew what he was. They had his profile. They didn't want this guy anywhere near an airplane. So what they had an arrangement. They took young Bush, drug habits and all, and other strange behaviors, and they put him in the neighboring state, where he was supervised by a couple of military people. And they tried to debug him, tried to get the drugs out of him, make him look sane. They never really succeeded. So then the time came where they were going to put this clown into the presidency. They said, don't worry about it. we call him the president. We'll name him the president, but he won't run the government. In fact, he couldn't run the government. All right? So these are the kinds of realities that our government has been so corrupt. And the fact that Prescott Bush was the guy who put Hitler into power, though he did it for a Wall Street crowd, but he was the one that did it. That was his nature. He was a Wall Street evil clown. And he had a son who was no damn good. And the son was, his mother pounded on golf balls and tennis rackets. And I think some of them hit his head a few times. But the point is, so the usual version of history is presidents come and go and this bunk. The thing is done that Wall Street in particular really is an agent of the British Empire, especially since the beginning with the assassination of the President of the United States before, to put in a certain Roosevelt, who was not a good one, Theodore Roosevelt. And since that time, with the exception of Franklin Roosevelt, there was no effective President of the United States who could be called a President of the United States in terms of principle. Franklin Roosevelt. What happened when Franklin Roosevelt died? You got Truman. What was Truman? Truman was the same thing. He was a Wall Street bum. They call him, a honky from hat salesman from Missouri. He was a Wall Street bum. And he was nothing but a stooge for the British, for Bertrand Russell, and for the British monarchy. So the point is, this whole history was, you had a miracle. John Kennedy, President Kennedy, was almost a miracle. Then they killed him because he wasn't going to let them have a war in Indochina. And they killed him and got the war. And Johnson, the vice president, said himself that he had the guns against his head were aimed at him, and he wasn't going to do anything. And that's the nature of this system. So that we have to understand the reality of the thing. Going back to our Constitution, to what is the Constitution of the United States, has been so violated that, raped prostitutes take pity on our presidency.
Before proceeding to the final question of tonight, I would like to recommend strongly to our viewers that they turn to the detailed documentation on the LaRouche PAC website of, again, the London and Wall Street role in one of the more recent attempted assassinations of a presidency of the United States in the case of Bill Clinton, because it was their operation directly which led, among other things, through the Lewinsky affair to the revocation of the Glass-Steagall bill in 1999, from which the United States has yet to recover. In fact, I think that it's most appropriate that the bill which was approved to get rid of the Glass-Steagall bill should properly be named the Graham-Leach-Bliley-Lewinsky bill. And also people should take note of the fact that Lyndon LaRouche was not an observer of those developments. He was a direct, first-hand participant, and you will find on the documentation on this website the kind of evaluation of what is actually going on, which is simply not available elsewhere. And it is true, and all other versions are false. Now, for the final question for this evening's webcast, I do have a question about current events. For over 3,000 years, Europe has been a battleground between two contending concepts of man. Helga Zepp LaRouche issued a statement earlier this week, which is widely circulating across Europe in different languages. Its title is A General Declaration of Independence of European Nations, in which she wrote, and I quote, "The first tendency in this battle, this 3,000-year-old battle, The first tendency is the oligarchical system, in which a small, elitist ruling class attempts to impose its privileges upon the majority of the population. The second tendency is the Republican principle, which aims for optimal development of the creative capacities of the citizens. Adequate metaphors, she wrote, for these two tendencies as historical forms are the Greek mythological figures of Zeus and Prometheus. Close quote. As Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche further notes, the European Union today, which was created and is run by the British Empire, stands up tall for Zeus, all 3,000 years of that bestial tradition. For example, number one, the European Union is attempting to organize a Nazi coup in Ukraine, which may well be the shortest possible path to a direct nuclear confrontation with Russia. Number two, the EU has decreed that all European nations are required by the year 2016 to include drugs and prostitution in their statistics of GNP, which incidentally will now be renamed gross narco product. And this is being adopted already in Spain. They're trying to get a jump on this 2016 deadline. They say this is going to increase their GNP by 10 billion euros of prostitution and drugs. Number three, the EU's troika policies have led to the destruction of that region's physical economies with the intended result of deliberate depopulation and genocide, which is something that more than 50 websites across Russia have been documenting recently by covering a release published by LaRouche's Executive Intelligence Review magazine, which presented Mr. LaRouche's strategic evaluation of this policy. This Russian publication of this documentation included a series of graphs which you saw here first on this webcast. One of those Russian sites, Pravda.ru, wrote, and I quote, American economist Lyndon LaRouche called the demographic policy of the EU a policy of genocide. He pointed out that as of 2012, over 5 years, the population of 14 European countries has decreased in absolute terms. Close quote. And here on your screen, you can see the Russian language version of EIR's map showing this absolute population collapse in 14 countries. They're shown in yellow. Resuming the quote from Pravda.ru. LaRouche wrote that this was not just some horror movie. This is done consciously. The British Empire has openly declared that the human population should be reduced. The easiest and most effective way to do so is to reduce the potential relative population density to a level that does not allow maintaining the current level of the population. Close quote. And here on your screen, you again see the Russian language version of the potential relative population density graphic, with the blue line indicating potential relative population density plunging below actual population, which is depicted in red, which then leads to the drastic collapse of that population, and intentionally so. Now, although there are a growing number of voices across Europe which are being raised against this insanity from the EU and London, both on the economic genocide front and also on the question of the danger of nuclear war, few, if any, propose a solution. And in this regard, Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche's Declaration of Independence is uniquely significant for just that purpose, because it brings up the most profound issues for the necessary discussion. And I would like to quote what she has to say on this. She says, "What is Promethean in man is his creative power. The oligarchy hates and fears the creative mental powers of free individuals, which means the defeat of oligarchical rule." Mrs. Zepp-LaRouche then goes on to note that, quote, "The historical significance of Christianity is that it overcame the system of empire in principle based on the notion of capax Dei, man's capacity to participate in God and in his infinite creative capacity." close quote, and she goes on to note the role of Nicholas of Cusa and his groundbreaking scientific work, which was at the heart of the founding and the development of what became the American Revolution and the American Constitution here in the New World. And that these are the principles that are required today to win the battle for Europe's soul. Perhaps you would elaborate on the role of the American Revolution and the U.S. Constitution in this 3,000-year-old battle.
The U.S. Constitution was not a contract. It may have the effect of replacing the idea of that kind of agreement. Not just an agreement among people, here's what we agree to, here's our policies. It is not that. And this was made very clear by the Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton's the U.S. Constitution was not going to work. It had been established, the terms of the Constitution would have been established, but they weren't going to work. But what happened is the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, saved the situation because the United States would have died right then except for Hamilton's introduction of this. And he had three basic programs, which he did in 3 successive years. Each year he did a program. And the combination of all three were what saved the United States from self-destruction. What has been ever since then, the British Empire has sought to destroy that Constitution. Now, some foolish people think that that Constitution is simply a set of agreements, terms of agreement. It is not. It is not a contract. It is something far higher in character than any contract. It is not a document that you sign to like a legal agreement. It's higher than that. It's beyond all legal agreements. It's a statement of 3 demonstrations of a common principle. And that, when ending up with on manufactures, which is the 1972 version, that brings on a conception of government which has never existed anywhere in the world prior to that time. What is done, first of all, you say, well, it's only a statement of this and that. We could change this, we could eliminate that, we could also add something else. So what happened, they made a mishmash of the Constitution by interpretation. And Thomas Jefferson, as president, was one of the first people who wrecked and ruined the federal Constitution of the United States. And you had, later on, in the 1820s, we had 2 great presidents come in during that period. They were actually destroyed virtually in terms of their power, everything they represented, everything that Alexander Hamilton had defined, which were an integral functional part of the Constitution. What Hamilton did was put some reality into the Constitution itself. So it wouldn't be just a contract. It would be an integral doctrine of policy concerning the life of the nation, the rights of the people in terms of the rights of the nation, the rights of the people as under a constitution of that kind, the rights of the nation, an agreement which Cusa had, in a sense, already indicated, a notion of principle, not a contract, a principle, not a contract. The U.S. Constitution is not a contract. It's a principle. It's a principle for all times. The application of the principle may change with times. Conditions of life change. The Constitution need not be changed, because every element of the Constitution, each 1 year after the other, 3 contractual elements, which are really, as Jefferson, or rather Hamilton intended. Hamilton was giving George Washington, President George Washington, a programmatic means by which the contract interpretation of the Constitution would be eliminated by the instatement of a principle, which these three elements, including banking, which has been destroyed. The principle of banking has been destroyed in the United States by these Thomas Jefferson and others. The principle of manufactures is made a shambles. But these three principles combined together make a government under principle, a universal kind of principle, for now and for our posterity. And what these British clowns have done, these imperial clowns, these Zeusian clowns have done, is to destroy the actual meaning of our Constitution by giving it a little slightly different twist. And the twist should be, for these guys, with a rope applied to the proper part of the anatomy.
With that, I would like to bring today's proceedings to a conclusion. Let me remind people that tomorrow at 3 o'clock on the LaRouche PAC website, there will be a special basement webcast titled The Continuing Gifts of Prometheus, featuring Jason Ross, Leona Fan Chang, and Cody Jones. That's 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and there will be audience participation, so send your questions to xxi.science@gmail.com. So thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Dennis. That brings a conclusion to our webcast. Good night.